Thank you so much, Professor Daniel Lipanderol. And thank you to everyone as well, and to the organizer of the CESRAN conference. It's a pleasure, of course, to me to be here just to share a couple of ideas, especially that I try to develop over this new phenomenon that we are facing, as it is the globalization and post-globalization, or deglobalization, as others out or try to point it out. So I try to bring a little bit these ideas, and especially what could be the role of Latin American countries, and especially the fact that Latin America has been connected with the globalization through trade. Okay, so I will try to observe, of course, the economic, financial, especially the economic and trading dimension. But also, given my nature as political analyst and international analyst, I will include certain concepts, of course, of states. So one of the main debates that appears in my presentation has to do with the role of the debate. And if there is this myth that states are against market, state versus market, that is very constant, and we can see how this debate has been developed by outstanding economists like Danny Roderick, Joseph Stiglitz, and so on. Okay, so just I want to start by defining specifically what do I mean by globalization, a period that we have lived around the last 50 years, probably, especially as a result of the Bretton Woods Accords, with the creation of these institutions that are still governing the international arena, like the IMF, the World Bank, the World Trade Organization, as it is since 90s, of course. So I will define globalization not in a just technical way, but I prefer to look at globalization as part of the result of the precise historical moment. So in that sense, for this work that I'm trying to develop for this paper, is that we understand globalization as the process of increasing, of course, commercial, economic, and financial interdependence and dependence among states and non-state actors within the governance of the Bretton Woods Accords. It implies for sure the adoption of a certain and a specific economic model. That means the free trade model, the neoliberal model, as we used to say it also in Latin America. And also, it has a condition of power. That means that it was created under the unipolar order of the United States, specifically, and the broader sense of the Atlantic Alliance, we may say. These Bretton Woods institutions, we cannot neglect that they have been successful in creating for the first time, let's say, an order, an international trade regime. If we trace back and how was history before the Bretton Woods institutions, practically we can say that in the mercantilist era, we are going to find that opening, let's say, the trade barriers for exporting products was basically through gangs by wars, okay? So in this case, we can see that diplomacy, of course, this aspect might be highlighted as a very important contribution from Bretton Woods regime, especially if I'm contrasting with the past of the wars of trade, that coercion, in this case, diplomacy replaced coercion. So that, of course, has been a success. But as any regime or group of institutions, we can observe that the results, of course, probably were not those results that we have expected. That when those institutions were created, there were many expectations also around globalization, the promise of lifting out of poverty millions of people, of reducing inequality. But we can see that the results, of course, of this globalization, specifically in trading terms, hasn't been that homogeneous everywhere. We can see mixed results, especially if we compare, of course, East Asia, that this region has been particularly successful. And in the case of Latin America, that unfortunately, we didn't have good results with globalization and neoliberal model, unfortunately. So the establishment of this organization in Latin America, we need to focus specifically on the role, especially of the IMFs, I will say, and the structural adjustment programs, that they were not that positive. During 80s, we were facing this debt crisis, and of course, there were many loans coming, especially from the IMF. These structural adjustment programs, of course, they try to enshrine certain austerity in the states in Latin America. So, state investment in welfare areas such as health, education, these investments were reduced. This, as a consequence, sparked protests, repertoire, social mayhem, and political instability across the region, I think in the majority of the countries at least. So the promise of globalization and free trade as ways to alleviate poverty and to reduce inequality fell short before, we can say, the expectation. What these Bretton Woods institutions are saying? What is the argument? Because we can say that at least since the 90s, there has been certain disconformity with these institutions, and they respond basically, at least if we judge what Kristalina Georgieva, the managing director of the IMF, she recently has stated that she agrees that, of course, these Bretton Woods institutions, they need an overhaul, but especially in the review of quotas. So they are not focusing, the Bretton Woods system, unfortunately, is not reflecting the new change in geopolitical area. It's not reflecting that we have a new emerging country, or there's the rising of China, especially, or regional powers as Brazil, for example. So in this, we don't have any hint from the IMF, for instance, to think that any kind of review or overhaul, especially in the governance bodies, is possible at the head of the Bretton Woods. We might take that one point of tension, and that is why, just to mention the previous presentation of my colleague in Argentina, that she was providing us some figures regarding the how China has become a financial important actor in Latin America, has to do especially with this type of policies on the IMF. We can say that another relevant point of tension has been to find a balance between creditors' satisfaction and the sovereign right of nations to find their own development path. Okay, so eventually we find that this sort of SAPs, as I was mentioning, they were imposed, reducing the room of maneuver of the state. So, as Danny Roderick used to claim, where there is globalization, there are rules. What they are, who impose them, and how, those are the only real questions. So here, I want to say that, or maybe I was wondering if it's possible to have different types of globalization surviving altogether. I mean, I was defining as the present globalization, the result of the governance, especially of the United States. It is possible to have two orders in that sense, to have also the BRICS proposal surviving or living together with the neoliberal model, or what is going to be the extension. So emerging powers like China and Russia instead had preferred to portray as the advance of the multipolarity. If we see the narrative of the IMF, for example, and especially Bretton Woods officials, they are saying we are living in a period of fragmentation, rise protectionism around the world, not especially in the G20, so not in the, we can say, developing countries where they affected of the globalization. No, especially the protectionism is rising in the G20. So this we need to think about it. So emerging powers like China and Russia instead have preferred to portray this as the advance of the multipolarity, or as the recent fifth BRICS summit plus was in the last few days, was stated as an inclusive multilateralism. So in my view, the BRICS is reading the picture correctly in the sense of filling this type of vacuum of, especially in the desires in the global south, to going through to have a voice in a multilateral system. Okay, how can we have a voice? So the BRICS, at least so far, is reading well in that sense. So we can say that there have been certain needs. The first is that this rise of protectionism was result of the COVID pandemics. And we can see, if we compare different periods of time, that this is not true, that the protectionism is rising, especially since 2008 of the financial crisis, international financial crisis. So we can see and we can interpret it that rather this long-standing consequence, negative consequence, have provoked this race of protectionism, not only the COVID pandemic in the 2020. Also, that there is a second myth that only global South countries were negatively affected by globalization. No, we can see that also, for example, inequality in the United States, the leading country of the globalization, we can say, was rising since 70s. Also, third myth, that always that we are now facing this protectionism, but if we observe long periods of history, we can see that at several moments we have faced waves of protections and waves of free trade. So this is just part of the pattern. So it's not an exception. So going to the case of Latin America, I had to jump because of the time. I have a lot of data, of course. In the case of our continent, Latin America hasn't been that inserted, never was inserted so deep in the globalization process. So if we compare from one decade, 2012 until 2021, for example, we can say that always international trade in Latin America represented less, at least between 5 to 10 points, than to the rest of the world. So we are below of the average in the representation or how it represents international trade. We can have a lot of arguments in that, but especially the Latin American economies have not strove for further diversification in terms of patterns and productions. So even though we have changed of partner, nowadays it's probably China, the most important partner in Latin American countries, and it's not anymore the United States, but the United States is still probably the second or the first, depending on the country. But the problem of Latin America, that irrespectively, disregarding of the model, it has been a primary exporter since the colony. And this role hasn't changed. And it's interesting, if we look at the history, especially, there is an interesting research, if you have time to consult, made by the economist John Williamson. He has studied inequality, for example, by collecting data from 29 places over 2 millennia. And he finds something very interesting and striking. After 1879, Latin America saw a rapid increase in inequality as commodity exports boom, benefiting the elite who own much of the region's cropland and minerals. So what let us know through this finding is that actually the booms, they increased inequality. So there was not a body to redistribute accordingly this wealthy income coming from those boom exports. Okay, so liberalization in this case of the globalization in Latin America exacerbated this pattern and provided to the powerful economic and financial group the theoretical justification for extend their application as matter of elites rather than as matter of state. That is still the main problem in the majority of the countries of Latin America. There was, in the case of East Asia, there was the state leading the process of redistributing or enforcing policies to administrate, to manage the globalization. In the majority of the countries, we can find that there was this state rather was the opposite, minimized in certain countries. So we don't have a strong state or a public policy to manage correctly the globalization as a process. So in these last years, we can see as well that with the deglobalization process, Latin America hasn't changed this policy of its role as primary exporter. Was this understanding that maybe because of this, the rising, the emerging powers may could have new policies, especially for transfer of technology. But so far, we can see that Latin America is still behaving in the same way as a primary exporter. So just as a proposal, of course, because of the time, I don't have a lot of, I have a lot of points left there. But an important and interesting point to highlight is that, of course, it's still not evident that the Beijing consensus, I mean the BRICS, could automatically, as the Washington consensus did, lead to a mindset change, especially among elite groups, to a more public investment orientation in Latin America. The pragmatic side of China and Latin American elites have blended well so far, providing that business and interest prevails over any old-fashioned perception of China in the continent. In conclusion, two factors might incentive to productive elites to abandon the commodities trap. One internal that has to do with establishment of social contract as a precondition to increase the trust in the state as an independent actor, and other external that has to do with incentives or international trade policies to foster innovation. This means a revision of restrictions and the enforcement of a gradual or differentiated reduction of costs of knowledge transfer to developing countries. In this regard, regional integration mechanisms can be the negotiator strongholds, of course. So my question, finally, to close my presentations, can we have one type of globalization, or is likely that different understandings of globalization could emerge and live together? How these globalization ideologies may compete and change the Latin American elites' minds. Thank you so much.